A George W. Bush White House insider is revealing what really happened in the march to war with Iraq 10 years ago. The former speechwriter, CNN contributor, is David Frum. He writes about it in the latest online edition of Newsweek. David is joining us here in the Situation Room. Excellent article you wrote. Very moving. Among other things, you write this in terms of the buildup to the war. You might imagine that an administration preparing for a war of choice would be gripped by self-questioning and hot debate, yet that discussion never really happened. For a long time, war with Iraq was discussed inside the Bush administration as something that would be decided at some point in the future. Then, somewhere along the way, war with Iraq was discussed as something that had already been decided long ago in the past. Give us a little flavor. Take us behind the scenes in the build-up to the war.
Well, I was a strong proponent of the war, both in government and then afterwards when I left in
Germany.
You
were firmly convinced they had weapons of mass destruction.
I was firmly convinced they had weapons of mass destruction. So, and I've spent a lot of time over the past 10 years wrestling with Iraq. And I think some of the things that happened were for the good. I think in some ways the world is better with Saddam Hussein gone. And yet, it's hard to describe what happened in Iraq as a success. And that what you're putting your finger on is this process of decision-making. You know, it's kind of a mystery when the United States made the decision to go to war in Iraq. As late as July of 2002, the British government was treating this as if it were an open question. They sent an emissary to Washington to discuss what were the Americans thinking. And yet, President Bush seems to have made up his mind sometime earlier, probably very early. It was something we were talking about from the very beginning of the Bush administration at the beginning of 2001.
You were among the team that helped write the speech, the 2002 Bush State of the Union address, with this very, very memorable passage. Listen.
This is a regime that agreed to international inspections, then kicked out the inspectors. This is a regime that has something to hide from the civilized world. States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
You say that the speech marked a sort of a point of no return as far as the war was concerned.
Well, I wouldn't say a point of no, but a real milestone. Here's what I think in that speech really stands up to the light of history. You know, back when President Bush spoke those words in 2002, it was considered quite shocking and bizarre to think that there might be cooperation between Hamas and Iran. Back then, the conventional wisdom was, well, Hamas espouses Sunni Islam, Iran espouses Shiite Islam. It's impossible that they would cooperate, except we know that they do. It was considered impossible that a Stalinist regime like North Korea would cooperate with Iran, and yet we know now that they do. We know that North Koreans were involved in helping Syria develop a nuclear facility that the Israelis bombed in 2007. When President Bush laid out those ways of thinking about the terrorism problem, he was saying things that have been largely vindicated. But it's also true that that speech marked a moment where the United States really did begin to move rapidly toward a war with Iraq on the claim that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, meaning for most people, nuclear weapons. And that turned out not to be true.
And you end the article with some soul-searching. You say this: all of us who advocated for the war have had to do some reckoning. If the case for war had been argued in a less contrived and predetermined way, it would have been different. All right, so 10 years later, was the war a blunder?
10 years later, the war was a prize that cost more than the prize was worth, I think.
And yet so the answer is yes, it was a blunder.
It was certainly, but when you say that, I don't want to deny that we have important benefits from the war that also have to be put into the mix, and it's easy to lose sight of those. And here's the thing I would invite people to consider. Two things. First is, in all the years when we said Saddam Hussein was in his box, he was spending revenues that were produced by oil at $20 a barrel. Oil has been at $100 a barrel since 2005. What would Saddam Hussein have been like if he'd had the enormous revenues that he would have had from the higher prices commanded by China and into India's entry into the global marketplace in the way that they've done? And the second thing to bear in mind is that a lot of our ability now to put pressure on Iran exists because Iraq has so hugely returned to the international oil market. Iraq is now the world's #3 oil exporter. It's that makes the sanctions regime on Iran possible in a way that it was not possible back in the 1990s when Iraq was off oil.
And the fact that Nouri al-Maliki's regime in Baghdad is pretty much aligned with Iran right now, well, that was never in your vision.
That was certainly not in my vision. But ironically, while his regime is aligned with Iran, the objective facts of the energy market mean that this new Iraq is a problem for Iran, not a source of strength for Iran.
David Frum, excellent article in Newsweek magazine, which is online in the Daily Beast. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
When we come back, the most interesting cast of candidates in a political race in a long time: Ted Turner's son, Stephen Colbert's sister, and a disgraced governor.